I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Certainly, COVID-19 dominated the headlines in Alberta this year, but that's not all that was going on in Alberta politics. This is your Under the Dome year in review for 2020.
And that budget laid out a complete four-year fiscal plan, a fiscal plan that would bring this province to balance within our first term, by year 4.
The level of lack of trust, shall we say, in this Minister of Health for his behavior, his lack of leadership, the directions he's taken, the imposition on physicians, the doing healthcare reform to us and not with us is unacceptable for physicians.
Alberta Health has modelling, AHS has modelling, the Minister has modelling. Albertans do not have up-to-date modelling. Why is that?
And let's be clear, this is not Albertans getting out a begging bowl. We don't look for welfare as a province, Mr. Speaker. We look for fairness.
To stand up to Kenny! Stand up to Kenny! Stand up to Kenny!
Initially, AISH was a program designed for the severely handicapped. But the population of people qualifying has been growing far faster than the overall population. And so they have to look at issues like that. What are the criteria? How do we define severely handicapped in this day and age?
As I'm sure you'll appreciate, this has not been an ordinary year.
My guests today, two of my post-media colleagues. First, we have Lisa Johnson. She's a legislature reporter for the Edmonton Journal. And we have Sammy Hudes. He covers politics for the Calgary Herald. So today we are talking about the year in Alberta politics. And I know for the bulk of that year, that means the pandemic. We've had going on 9 months of COVID-19 coverage. I imagine both of you maybe have COVID fatigue even. So I do want to touch on that a bit, but first I want to get to we have a bunch of categories we want to run through. We want to talk about newsmakers of the year. We want to talk about who caught your attention so far this year. And I think that it serves us really well to remember that even as COVID was going on, the government was, plowing through with its legislative agenda. And there was a lot happening in Alberta politics in addition to managing the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess the first category we have today is the biggest news story aside from the pandemic. And there's a lot there to look at. There was the provincial budget, there was the oil price crash, the provincial corporate tax break, even though that was tied into kind of helping to stimulate the economy because of the pandemic. So Lisa, I'm going to start with you here first. What for you was the biggest political news story in Alberta outside of COVID-19?
For me, without a doubt, it was the war with doctors, not just because it dovetailed with the COVID pandemic and we find ourselves speaking with doctors as often as we can to cover the COVID pandemic, but because two really important things kind of had a ripple effect on politics and the province this entire year. And those were the government's moves to basically rein in healthcare spending. One of them tied to the Ernst & Young review of AHS, and the other changing the billing codes for doctors, what doctors could bill the government for. And it wasn't just one story, it was almost daily coverage for months.
And what about for you, Sammy? What was your number one story outside the pandemic for 2020?
Yeah, I have a few. In terms of stories I covered, the biggest one on my radar was the story about potential cuts coming to AISH that we're going to see in the new year. That's the Assured Income for the Severely Handicapped program. And in September, I had heard from a senior source in the government who said that cuts are coming. They're not going to be minor in nature. And it's going to affect, people who rely on this program, who live in poverty, and that's currently on the agenda when it came to, as we mentioned, the UCP wanting to bring spending in line. It seemed that that's still extended even to, the vulnerable people in society, according to this source. And, later after the story was reported, the Premier did say publicly that, yes, we're going to look at eligibility criteria, who qualifies for this program, and a review is ongoing. So we're going to find out a bit more about that in the new year. Otherwise, big stories that can't come to mind. The opioid crisis in Alberta, and specifically in the Calgary area where I cover, has been a huge one. In fact, during the second quarter of 2020, opioid-related deaths actually outpaced COVID-related deaths. People have kind of called it the silent pandemic or the secondary pandemic. It's a huge issue, and I think a lot more people obviously know about, the amount of people dying from the COVID-19 pandemic, and rightfully so. It's a huge issue in itself, and one that has a lot of consequences for people. But there's this other issue going on. There's the opioid crisis, and it's also, from a health perspective, a very massive story that perhaps deserves even more attention.
Turning our attention to the people who made up Alberta politics in 2020, I think there are a lot of people who kind of stood out in terms of policy, in terms of pandemic. I want to talk about the biggest newsmaker for 2020. Sammy, when you look at all the figures in provincial politics, who do you think was the one who stood out as the newsmaker of the year?
Yeah, Lisa's already alluded to it, but I don't see how it wouldn't be Tyler Shandro, the health minister. I mean, you start with the fact that there is this global pandemic that's been on the radar throughout most of this year in Alberta, and obviously the health minister is at the center of that. But just as Lisa mentioned, the fight with doctors that began before that, there were news stories that came out about various scandals about the health minister allegedly confronting a doctor on his driveway and screaming at him because of a post he had on social media disagreeing with the policies. It's been an embattled year for the health minister in this province, and obviously all eyes have been on him as we try and navigate this pandemic. Secondarily, obviously, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer, would be in line as well. But I just think that when it comes to, for good or for worse, Tyler Shandro has just been at the center of everything this year.
Lisa, what about you? Does Tyler Shandro stand out as the figure that kind of made the most waves in 2020, or is there someone else that sticks out for you?
Oh, absolutely, Tyler Shandro. But I think we'd also have to keep in mind that he wouldn't be the center of a lot of news stories if it weren't for the pushback that he was getting from, public health experts. We've heard a lot from Dr. Lorraine Hardcastle has been a vocal critic of the government, and others that we've spoken to quite a bit. And so I have to say it's got to be doctors, a lot of rural doctors, healthcare experts in general. I mean, I can't think of a time when we've ever turned to them as much as we did this year as reporters.
At the start of the year, the government had hoped for better performance from the oil sector, despite early hurdles from the price war between OPEC and Russia and the early COVID slowdown. What does this year mean for the government's energy agenda, and how important is the sector to the government and the post-COVID recovery?
Well, Dave, I don't think that you can underestimate how important the industry is to Jason Kenney, and he signaled that all year long. He's given reprieves for environmental monitoring during COVID, something that he was criticized for. But one thing I think that the government scored a win on this file was the 3-year tax exemption for energy companies drilling new oil wells or building new pipelines in Alberta. Because when this was first proposed, there were a few different options, a few different models that they brought to rural municipalities. And the Rural Municipality Association was really sounding the alarm and saying that this was going to devastate their tax base. But when the new Municipal Affairs Minister, Tracy Allard, came in to the negotiations, I think things really smoothed out. They eventually announced a 3-year tax exemption that they estimate will save the industry about $81 to $84 million. And the RMA was not as vocally opposed. They really acquiesced and called it a compromise. So I think that he'll be touting that as a win. And there's a number of things that, of course, he's done to support the biggest one, obviously, is the major investment in Keystone XL. There's no other single spending announcement that compares to that.
Sammy, what about for you? What do you make of the year in oil and gas and its effect on the province and how the government has responded?
For sure. And yeah, like mentioned, there were some wins. On the other hand, I think it could be classified as a year of setbacks. Obviously, when the budget came out in February, we heard from the province just how much they intended to keep relying on this industry when it came to their revenues. They forecasted growth in the sector, increased capacity. with the caution that if the COVID-19 pandemic eventually affected Alberta, we might have to go back to the drawing board, and that's exactly what happened, obviously. So obviously they didn't have the intended effects that they were anticipating. With Keystone, there's the investment there, and Joe Biden being elected in the States has signaled that that's not going to be the direction he's taking. So that's just another setback for the government. We'll see what the future holds next year, but I don't think this year could be classified as one that Jason Kenney wanted to see when it came to the oil and gas sector and the prosperity he was hoping for.
Is there any figure in Alberta politics that you feel fell off the radar, or you expected to hear more from at the start of the calendar year, that as the year went on and as we got consumed with COVID-19, that they kind of dropped our attention?
Sammy, go ahead.
Sorry. For me, actually, I'd have to say Jason Luan was somebody I was expecting to hear a lot more from throughout the year. That's the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. You go back way to the start of the year in the before times, so to speak. I think it was February that the government came out with its panel report on supervised consumption services throughout the province. And that's been a very hot button issue here in Calgary with the lone supervised consumption site. There's been various reports since it was found, since it became operational a few years ago, about crime in the area, and the UCP has been very focused on that since it came to power in terms of trying to make things better for the surrounding neighbors and businesses. Well, so this report comes out in February, and it details a system of chaos, I think is the words that they used. And obviously, we're all expecting the UCP to take some immediate action, or at least, in the next few months to maybe close it down or move it, or something's going to happen, right? But then the pandemic hits, and we haven't heard anything about, what's going to happen with the supervised consumption site here in Calgary. I know they've made a decision on the Lethbridge one. They decided to defund it based on some issues going on behind the scenes immediately. But this has kind of just dropped off the radar. And I talked about the opioid crisis and how much it's been escalating this year. I know my colleague Alana Smith has been trying to ask the government what's happening with the site here, what's happening with the sites elsewhere in the province, and they say stay tuned, stay tuned. There hasn't been a lot from Minister Luan on this since then, and there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know if this site's going to continue to exist, or even if the UCP has changed course, if it's switched its approach to this. There's really no way of knowing because they haven't said.
Yeah, Lisa, what about for you? Who has not shown up as much as you expected that they might in 2020?
Well, there have been a few political, initiatives that have been put a little bit on the back burner or delayed by COVID-19. And one thing I was expecting to hear a lot more of this year was Alberta separatism. The Fair Deal panel was announced in December, I think, by Premier Jason Kenney. And we did hear a lot about it. They certainly made headlines, and so did a lot of outspoken proponents of Alberta independence. But I feel like it lost a lot of steam in terms of capturing headlines later on this year. And part of that, the Fair Deal panel was set up to placate, the separatist interests, and in part I think it did, but it also kind of fell by the wayside. And that's not to say there wasn't a lot of discussion around the issue. Premier Jason Kenney also, he made on Corey Morgan's podcast, and seemed to make an effort to speak to that part of his base. And MLA Drew Barnes, who's the MLA for Cypress Medicine Hat, has also been quite vocal, even going as far as to kind of complain in the legislature that his voice wasn't being heard on the issue. So that for me is kind of an ongoing interesting saga that we didn't get to spend as much time on this year as I thought we would.
Now, we know this year there have been some public controversies, especially around healthcare, as we've touched on with this government. But there have also been areas where they seem to have shown some success, especially early on in the pandemic. We had higher testing than other jurisdictions in Canada and some places around the world. Our contact tracing was pretty good early on, and we were in a good position in terms of PPE and things like that the pandemic, the first wave, we kind of came through more unscathed than other areas. Are there other places where the government fared well this year for you, Sammy?
Yeah, and a couple of things come to mind in addition to that. Obviously, the testing during the first wave of the pandemic. Alberta, I think, at one point was the third best region in the world when it came to the testing per capita, as Jason Kenney was touting at the time. But a couple other things, as I mentioned, when it came to the response to the opioid crisis. The government has been praised by some in the sector for its response when it comes to recovery and treatment and that focus. Obviously, they haven't had the same praise when it comes to harm reduction, but when it comes to treatment and whatnot, we've heard from those in the nonprofit sector who say that they've had a very good emphasis on that side of things. The other thing that comes to mind, I believe it was in June that the government announced its $10 billion economic recovery plan to come out of the pandemic, and they promised it would create about 50,000 more jobs, various funding to various infrastructure priorities. It was praised by economists at the time as a big spend that kind of brings this government in line with the past government spending. Here in Calgary, Mayor Naheed Denchi has said that there's various priorities that he's hoping to see that money go to, and was pleased to that the announcement came. So those are a few things that come to mind where the government was praised for some of the action that it took this year.
And Lisa, what about for you? Where were some successes for this government in 2020?
Well, I think the big obvious overall success, and this is something that we're going to hear Jason Kenney brag about, I think, in the future, is how aggressively he pursued legislation this year. I mean, some 50 bills passed. I think his supporters should be gleeful at the amount of legislation that they've gotten out of the way, particularly the controversial stuff, the stuff that they've been criticized most for, because, conventional political wisdom is you get that out of the way in the first half of your mandate. You could pick any example from the that made union dues opt in if they were going to be spent on political campaigns. So things like that, his base are going to support, and they're going to be happy to see. I also think that the relief support that this government offered for small businesses was a good step. The NDP will say that this is their idea. They called for it weeks before the government announced it, first in June, which was up to $5,000 grant for businesses that were shut down during the first shutdown. And then we saw in December in the most recent shutdowns that they expanded that to up to $20,000, and they expanded the eligibility for it. So I think that that in combination with, the emergency isolation support payments, which were obviously very flawed as they rolled out before CERB, were positives in a sense. I mean, these weren't philanthropic handouts. They were Jason Kenney recognizing that there was a real potential for the crisis to ripple out and spread. And so he did take some action there. He didn't do nothing.
Now, I know the question that's on a lot of people's minds as we head into 2021 and the government is looking at a pretty bleak budget position is, will we see a sales tax in 2021? Lisa?
Well, Travis Taves has spoken about this. He's very tentative whenever he speaks about it. The line that the government usually uses is, now is not the time to be introducing a sales tax. We're in the middle of the COVID recession, obviously. But he did offer some hints the last time he spoke at the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, kind of alluding to the McKinnon panel, which was tasked with examining spending. He said that the government would look at a similar panel looking at revenue. So I think that there are a lot of hints here. Whether or not that's going to happen or we're going to see a whole lot of movement on that file next year remains to be seen.
Sammy, what about you? Are you hearing that there could be talk of a sales tax, or do you think that's something that may get pushed back or not considered at all?
The short answer for 2021, I would say no. We're not going to see a sales tax next year. But there is some mixed messaging going on. In fact, right after the provincial budget that came out in February, before the pandemic even hit Alberta, Travis Taves came out at the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and that was really the first time that he was starting to signal that, maybe we need to look at some tax reforms, he clarified, in the long term. It was quite surprising at the time that he said that in front of that crowd, and There was a lot of questions about it in the media scrum afterwards, but he was quite careful, as Lisa mentioned later on with Edmonton as well, to say that this is not something that's going to be happening right away, but at some point, it's always been on the table that we're going to need to reevaluate Alberta's revenue structure. On the other hand, we hear from other members of the government, from the Premier himself, that Alberta has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. I believe he's used those words many times. So is it something that we might see eventually? It's hard to say. Before the pandemic, they were saying that certainly not in the first term, but perhaps after that, we might look at something along the lines of a sales tax. I don't know if that's been moved up because of the pandemic, but 2021, I would say, is much too soon to be expecting something that big to be coming in to replace how we currently operate.
Well, certainly was a busy year in Alberta politics in 2020, and we'll see what comes up in the new year. I'd like to thank my guests, Lisa Johnson and Sammy Hudes. You can find all these episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.